All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some different types of basic EQs, stuff that you're going to find without a doubt in every DAW that you're going to work in. The DAW that I'm using is Logic Pro X. I've been using this DAW forever, and I think it's actually it's a very good, well-rounded DAW for music creators like myself, people that kind of make our own music and like to dabble with different things, but still need a strong digital audio workspace in order to get our ideas across. And the beauty of Logic is that it has a lot of really great built-in plugins, especially EQs. So let's jump into the DAW and check some of these things out. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to open up the channel EQ. Now I have a few listed here so that I can show you some different variations of EQs that you're going to normally see. But let's check out the standard channel EQ that you would get if you opened up a brand new track. And it's going to look something like this. And this is called a graphic EQ. This is a graphic EQ because you see that there are the X and Y axes, whatever. So you see the X and Y, right? And you're able to then move things up and down, left and right, which is great. And the beauty of a graphic EQ is that you can visually see all of the variations in the frequencies. For instance, from the lowest frequencies, from say 20 hertz, all the way up to 20 kilohertz, which are high frequencies. Now, frequencies are just that. It's how fast something is moving. And this actually determines pitch, which I'll show you later. But in the lower frequencies, this is your sub-frequencies. This is the low end. This is the things that sound very deep and low. And then, of course, in the higher frequencies, the higher numbers, they are going to sound much higher in pitch. Makes sense. And the beauty of a graphic EQ is that you can see which directions you're moving them. In every way, shape, or form, you can visually see how you're sculpting the sound itself, which is really useful. That's really helpful. And so the next thing I'd like to talk about is some different types of tools within an EQ you're going to see on a regular basis. For instance, you'll notice here that on both sides, I have this sort of a bracket going on where it's actually cutting these frequencies off. Right? This is a low and high pass filter. Where I've always found that this is confusing is that you initially think low, you should be working on the low, right? And sort of cutting the low out. But that doesn't work because it's not a low cut, it's a low pass. Now, you will hear some people refer things as high cut, low cut, and it's exactly what you would think. And I guess this is where I'm used to hearing these phrases, high and low, is in this cut sort of scenario where it's like, oh, there's a low cut. Well, then I'm going to go to the low frequencies and start cutting them out, right? Or likewise, going to the high frequencies and cutting them out, right? And we're going to show you how all this works anyway, but just try to keep in mind low pass, high pass. Low pass is cutting out high frequencies. High pass is cutting out low frequencies. So low cut, high cut, you understand. Sort of interchangeable. All right, so the next thing I want to show you is some of the different types of curves that are in any kind of a graphic EQ. This is where you're going to see this the most. I will show you some other instances where you're going to see things like this elsewhere, but it's really nice on a visual graphic EQ to see the different curves. For instance, they call these bell curves because if you actually cut off the bottom here, it will resemble that of a bell, right? So bell curve, and this is what a bell curve looks like. So you're creating a bell in the frequency spectrum that you're bumping up the frequencies in that space. Or doing just the opposite, a bell curve that's reversed, that you're actually cutting frequencies out. This is called additive and subtractive EQing. The other types of curves we're going to see are these here, which are called shelves. And you can kind of see why they're called shelves. Because wherever I start to add this, it's going to continue adding those frequencies to the entire spectrum until you're actually cutting something with another type of curve, right? So those are pretty cool. So these are the three types of curves that you're going to see on a regular basis. Let me show you some of the other EQs that you would see pretty much everywhere. Again, like I said, Logic has a lot of great EQs that are already built in. Some of which most people that use Logic don't even know that they're there. So that's nice. Maybe I'll learn you a thing or two today. I don't know. But this is what you would say is sort of a modern type of graphic EQ. There's also something that is a bit more what some might recognize from, say, their amp, especially bassists. Bassists might have seen this particular EQ before, and I actually like that Logic put it in this sort of format that it looks just like the physical version of this type of EQ. But this is a graphic EQ that you're going to see a lot of times on things like bass amps, and that's just like this. Now, it's exactly the same setup, except for this is using physical style node sort of sliders, right, to change this thing. But essentially, you're doing the exact same thing as pushing this up and down and moving this left and right and whatnot. So when you're doing that, on this, you're just doing it with these different nodes. Now, the biggest difference here is that there's a little bit less functionality here. There's a little less control. This is essentially all bell curves. There are no shelves. There are no high and low passes. If you're trying to do a high pass or a low pass, you're basically just cutting frequencies completely off. And then everything else that's happening in between the graph, everything else that's happening is that of a bell curve. So keep that in mind when you're using this. The same thing will apply with your bass amp or an old PA or anything that's using something like this. You will see this on PAs pretty often. Little like power mixers and things like that a lot of bands use have this exact thing. And this is what's happening. And it works the same. It works just as well. It's just that it visually looks a little bit different. But this is what you're doing. So as you're tweaking through these settings, think about it just like you're tweaking settings on here like this, because this is basically what you're doing. And another type of EQ that you'll see, one that I particularly like, is the console EQ. Now, in Logic, again, this is something that they have built in. It's really great. It's resembling that of like a nice rack-mounted EQ, hardware, real good stuff. And you can see here that it's got some of the curves kind of built in there. You can turn those curves on or off. I think that's actually just sort of turning the actual knob on or off. Maybe not. So this is allowing you to tweak the same kind of curves. Now, in this case, you have a low cut. It doesn't give you the high cut. Because in most cases, what you should be concerned with is cutting the low frequencies. So some EQs don't even let you have a high cut or a low pass. Same thing. Because those frequencies are less important to cut because they're less intrusive in the entire mix. They take up less energy in the mix. So this is also another thing to kind of keep in mind. And again, we'll go into more detail about that later. And as you can see, we've got a knob for a low gain. This is giving us the shelf. This is the same as though we were going to add or subtract with this exact same kind of shelf. So that's doing the exact same thing. Again, with the mid frequencies, it's giving us the option of a bell curve. So this is the same as adding something like this. And then in the high gain, we have just a high shelf, which, of course, is this. Now, these types of EQs are fairly straightforward. The only thing that I think some people might find challenging is where the frequency sort of lies as far as these two things. This is where you're going to change the frequency. And basically when you're changing this, so say you put this to 200 hertz, this is where the point in which your EQ is starting to take shape starts at 220 hertz. Now this is the same as me taking this shelf and moving it to 220 hertz, right? And then up or down, you know, roughly. We can get that to sit on point, right? So that is exactly the same as me putting this to 220 and going up and down. Got it? Okay, and adding to the console style EQ, I'd like to show you one of my favorite kinds of EQ, and this is from the Waves plugin suite. It's an SSL style EQ. Now, when we see this kind of console EQ, right? We've just discussed this, and we can see that we have our shelves and we have our bells, and all this is nice. Now, sometimes with some of the higher end plugins, you'll find a few things that have a little bit more going on, and it will explain it with these abbreviations. Now on this particular EQ, you'll see here that we have HP, right? This stands for high pass, low cut, same thing. And you can see here where we've got these, it shows us our little cut that's cutting off these frequencies. And as we bring that up, that's bringing it up to 350 hertz. This is the same as bringing this all the way up to here, right? So we're looking at the exact same cut when we have these two different things set this way, right? So when you're bringing that all the way up, it's cutting out quite a lot of the low end. This will take out a lot of the low end frequencies. Again, we see this LMF. This isn't some kind of an abbreviation for mother. Could be. I don't think so. Actually, it just means low mid frequencies. So in this particular instance of a console EQ, as opposed to this one has one mid band. And they can be referred to these as bands. I sort of failed to mention that earlier. Each different frequency areas generally referred to as a band. So this particular console EQ has one mid-frequency band option, whereas this SSL has two. You have low mid frequencies and high mid frequencies. And I'm not going to get into all the different other buttons that are going on, because right now we're just focusing on understanding that if you turn one of these knobs, what is it going to do? Say, for instance, we're looking at this low mid frequency band, right? We see the bell curves, right? We talked about bell curves. We know that if we go this way or this way, we're adding or subtracting to the bell curve, right? So it's the same on here, except for now we have the ability to change the size of the bell curve. So obviously the further we go out to here, the wider the span of this bell curve. And again, we have the same option in sort of this plugin where we can do the same kind of thing. Now this allows you to go in and surgically EQ stuff. So if you're hearing a specific frequency that you don't like, say something is ringing, if it's a snare drum and you got bing, and you hear this little, and it might be subtle, you can go in and surgically cut that one frequency out, or just minimize it a little bit, make it a little less present in the sound of whatever you're EQing. And this is how you manage and control sound. And on this particular plugin, they have all three things sort of separated. This is the gain, this is the bell curve, and this is the actual frequency that it's sitting on. So everything that I can do in one fell swoop here on this particular plugin takes three different movements to adjust, right? So you're changing the hertz, the kilohertz here. That's what's moving it left and right on the graphic EQ this way. You are increasing or decreasing the gain. That's the same as adding or subtracting on the graphic EQ. Or you're changing the width of the bell curve, right? So this is something we can do like so, where this is affecting more or less frequencies as we adjust it, right? So that's the basic understanding of what's happening here. And again, I don't really want to go into a lot of this other stuff. We can make a whole video about SSL compressors. I actually have one that is my favorite. It's the SSL channel from Waves that actually puts an entire like analog mixing channel, which is what you would see on any like real physical mixer, which is nice. I'm used to seeing these kinds of things, but most of the time nowadays you're gonna see this kind of graphic EQ because it just makes sense. As you can see, as we're going through these different EQs, this is still the easiest one to work around because everything is laid out in front of you and you can manipulate everything easily. So the last EQ plugin that I'd like to show is another Waves plugin. I like to use a lot of Wave stuff. I've been using it for a long time. They're a tried and true brand of plugins for audio engineering. I've tried a lot. There's a lot that's great. There's a lot of really fantastic ones, and I would love to showcase each and every one of them as their own video, and I will do quite a few of them because I think there's some really great standout plugins. But for me, the Wave stuff has been perfect forever. It sort of always just does what you need it to do. And most of the time, those plugins are just emulating something that is real, like a physical thing. For instance, like the SSL solid state logic plugins, there's a whole suite of these plugins that branch off from different characteristics of an actual SSL board. an actual SSL mixing board, which is awesome. So why wouldn't you want to? How is that a bad thing? That's awesome. You know, but again, this is the old school where people are used to turning and dialing a knob. And then you have the new school where you can just sort of draw things in. I think both are powerful. Just sort of depends on the type of interface that you want to work with. But for those of you that just can't get enough crazy stuff to touch when it comes to tweaking and EQing things, you have something like the Waves HEQ. This thing is full-blown overkill, in my opinion. When I look at an EQ, this is the first thing that's going to make me go, nope, not today. Nope, I'm going to see my way out. But I'd like to try to break this down a little bit, just show you around. You're going to see a lot of things that you've seen from all the other things that I've talked about in this video. So it's going to seem fairly familiar in a general kind of way. I could easily spend a half an hour talking about just this plugin and the things that it does, because it does too much. But if you're looking for something that does too much, because maybe that's what you need, maybe you need something that has lots of features, then this is probably going to be a go-to. But for the purpose of this video, I just want to show you what overkill looks like. So in this case, you're going to see that we have the graphic EQ aspect of it, and we can actually go in and start changing some stuff, right? So we can add our low cut, high pass. We can do the same thing in the high here, right? And I want to show you how this translates. What's going on with this thing is, much like this particular EQ where you start moving something around, it gives me the information of what I'm changing right here on the specific band, right? Right, easy enough. The same thing is happening on this HEQ, when I change a parameter, it is changing it on the corresponding knob. So we can see here that I've changed this particular thing, right? Now, if I want to mess with the low frequency here, now this is going to give me a shelf because it's set to shelf, right? We can change the different bell curves just like that. And now it's set to shelf. And you can see as I move this node around, it's changing the virtual physical knob. So it basically gives you the option of changing it both ways. Now, there's a few different things that are going on here. It's got some different types of EQ tones. Now, these will emulate physical tones that are out there. For instance, an SSL mixer, or a Neve, or the British sound versus the American sound versus a digital, very clean, no coloration sound. That's what's going on here. So when you've got like US vintage, US modern, UK vintage, UK modern, and then the two different digital sounds, these are just different types of tonal characteristics, or color, as a lot of people will refer to them as. So just keep that in mind. You might find something that you like if you mess with this, say the British sound. If you're going for something a bit more rock and roll, try the UK vintage. If you're going for something much more modern and say metal, which might be the case, try the modern US. Maybe that's a thing. Or maybe try a mix of any of these things. Because at the end of the day, it's just about what sounds good to your ears. There is no real hard and fast rule to what type of EQ you should be using, or how you should be doing this, or what you should be making things sound like. This is art, and art can sound like whatever you want it to sound like. That's the point of art. So go nuts with this stuff. Real quick, before we move on to the next part of this video, I want you to have a look here on the graphic EQ, where you'll actually see a keyboard. That's interesting, right? So this is just another visualization of things like frequencies. And I want to get into something here and show you that as you move up and down the frequencies, they directly correlate to notes on the scale, on the piano, on the keyboard. So if you see here, I'll open up an instance of the piano roll, and I've just laid out a simple C major scale, where if you play around with a keyboard, you know it's just the white keys on the keyboard. And I want to show you on the EQ in the analyzer how it actually correlates, how the frequencies of the notes in that scale actually correlate to this visible analyzer. So let's check it out. So you could see as the notes gradually went up in pitch, you could see how they moved across the frequency spectrum on the equalizer, on the graphic EQ. This is a very useful tool for helping you pinpoint exact frequencies that you want to tame or accentuate by either adding gain to a certain frequency or reducing gain from a certain frequency. For instance, maybe we can have a little example here where we play this through. And you can hear how it's kind of like cutting some of the sound out. Well, that's because I'm using subtractive EQ to cut out some of the frequencies so that you can't hear it. Now, let me show you on a real track how you could utilize this sort of technique of picking out specific frequencies to tame or to control. Because again, this is the reason you use tools like EQs. You use it in order to control the sound and tame it into something that's usable for your recordings. So let's check out this track. I recorded a simple guitar track, and it goes a little something like this. All right, let me show you how the different bands sound in the different areas of the EQ and the different sections of the EQ. Let's have a listen to what each of these sounds like. If you look at the main analyzer from our plugin, right? You can see it actually kind of freezes here, which is kind of cool. What you see here is that there's lots of low end. There's lots of information happening way down here. There's a big spike in the 100 to 200 range, and then it sort of tapers off, and then by the time we get to something at around 8 kilohertz, we see that the information sort of drops off. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no high-end information. There's still information up here, and there's still information that goes down even further below 20 hertz that we just can't physically perceive as humans. This is why you see, in most cases, the spectrum on an EQ that you can measure is something from 20 hertz to up to something like 20 kilohertz, because this is what we hear as humans. So this is why bracketing off the high and low cuts is so important, because this is actually cutting off that information so that none of the information that you can't hear is actually being played through to your other plugins and the rest of the things that are happening on your track for your guitar or whatever. This is basically something you're going to do every single time you open an EQ. It really should be a standard thing that plugin companies just do automatically. They're just like, oh, here's your low cuts, here's your high cuts, and you can just adjust them where you want them. But they don't do that because, you know, free will and choice and all that stuff. So what I would suggest is for your high pass, you know, set it at something to begin with by default at around 30 hertz. Right around there, it's still a lot of low end. And on the guitar, I can show you here in a second where we're going to change a lot of this. But just to begin with, because you don't really know what instruments you're going to be putting through this EQ to begin with, you're going to want to have something that you can use with multiple instruments, drums, bass, vocals, all these things. Every single one you're going to set to completely different parameters, but you can have similar starting points. And for me, that's this right here. A low cut at 30 hertz and a high cut at somewhere around 12,000 hertz. Now, that can change depending on what kind of music that you're playing and writing. I think a lot of electronic music uses some frequencies that are up in the higher ranges there, just these really crispy sounds. Whereas rock music, it's not really all that necessary because I think the tonal range happens a bit lower than that. Let's have a listen to some different cuts that I've arranged so that you can hear the different tonal frequencies of this track across the EQ spectrum. So first, let's start with a heavy low pass. All right, so you hear how it's very woofy sounded. You almost hear no definition of the note at all. All you hear is that information is some of the most powerful information that can really wreak havoc across other plugins on your track, for instance, like compressors. Compressors pick up all this low end and just go crazy, even though what you hear doesn't really sound like it should be going crazy, but the compressor's going nuts. This is because it's got too much low end, and the low end is really, like, you can't hear it so much, but it's affecting the plugin. So we're going to talk about how we're going to cut some of that. Let's have a listen to the mid frequency and see what that sounds like. This is between 100 hertz and about 1K hertz. All right, so in this example, we can hear that this particular frequency range is what's giving the body sort of the nasally kind of sound. This is the boxiness area of tone, right? And this is going to apply for all things, vocals, drums, anything that you're putting through the EQ. You're going to notice that this is where that boxiness comes from. Some boxiness is okay, some boxiness is necessary, but also too much of it is not really that pleasant sounding. So this is an area that you're going to find yourself doing a lot of fine detailing in. For the last example, let's check out a high pass situation, an extreme high pass situation, where I have the high pass filter, the low cut, pulled all the way up to 1K hertz. All right, so this is only going to let higher frequencies come through to the speakers. So let's have a listen to it. So this is only going to let the really extreme high frequencies come through. And these frequencies is where you're going to add or subtract depending on the brightness of the sound that you're working on. So now we've heard the three basic frequency bands on an EQ. In most cases, if you're using a console style EQ with knobs, it's going to have low frequency, mid frequency, and high frequency. These are the general frequency ranges that you're going to be EQing and controlling through those few knobs that you have on that particular EQ. This is also, again, why graphic EQs are just so powerful, because you can really dial in everything exactly where you want it to be, and you can see it. It's visual. It's awesome. So let's play around with some of these other things so that we can really hear. We have this track, and if we want to really understand the power of high passing and low passing, or low cutting and high cutting, same stuff. If you really want to understand how powerful that is, let's have a look. Again, we can see that we have a lot of low end frequency here, but the spikes happen right around something like 120 hertz or so, right? So let's move this. We can actually do it from right here and see how it affects the track as we play along. All right, so you saw that I brought it all the way up to 200 hertz, and you could really hear that all the low end disappeared. But at first, it was very woofy and had a whole lot going on, and then somewhere in there, it sort of sounded nice and solid, and it had enough low end that still gave you the nice characteristic of heavy metal guitars. But then also, as we continued to go, you could hear that it was just nasally and just boxy sounding, with no resonance and nothing to really give you that feeling, right? So obviously you want to find something right in between that's going to do well. Again, before I mentioned something at right around 120 hertz. This, to me, is kind of the sweet spot for my guitars. My guitars are tuned in B. Something in that frequency range seems to work out pretty well for me. I also use heavy bass in my recording, so that covers up a lot of that stuff and adds those frequencies back anyway in the mix. But in this case, when we're just worrying about processing one track, it's good to start with this, because this is something that is in control. You're in control of that low end. So let's have a listen to it really quick for one phrase with it set to 120. So I flipped the plugin on and off so that it would allow all that information to go back and forth, like cutting the information, adding the information. And you could really hear a huge difference in the low end where I would turn off the EQ and suddenly it's just lots of woofy muddiness. You don't want that. You want tight, crisp, clean guitars. Now let's try something for the high end. Let's do the same thing briefly and just see where we can move the high cut until we start hearing an audible difference in the tone of that brightness or that brilliantness. Let's check it out. So I took it all the way down to about 6,000 hertz and moved it back and forth so you can really kind of hear how moving it in this small space actually does make some difference. Again, I generally have mine bracketed at about 12,000 hertz. That's where, for my ears and maybe for my speakers, I'm just not hearing any more information that I need that's taking away from the sound of the thing that I'm working on. In this case, this guitar track. We can see that when I started to move it down below 8,000 hertz, you were really starting to hear that the track was becoming very dull sounding. And this is what you don't want. You don't want dull sounding guitars. You do want a little bit of that sizzle in there, unless you're playing Doom, and then you might not want any of that high end in there. I don't know, up to you. But this is the basics of bracketing off and using high cut filters and low cut filters to really control that block of sound that you're working on for the guitar. Give that a try. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is how do you use the EQ in a way to either cut or add frequencies? What are the best principles or the best guidelines for doing this? Now, again, as I've mentioned before, there's no hard and fast rules. You can kind of do whatever you want. But there are some things that I think that you should definitely consider trying to make part of your practice when you are mixing guitars and processing a track. It's usually best to use subtractive EQing first. In most cases, the signal chain that you're going to have is an EQ going into something like a compressor, and then sometimes also another EQ. I know that seems a little strange and counterintuitive, but it's true. What you're going to do in most cases, what you should be trying to practice is using only subtractive EQ on your first EQ instance. So, for instance, in this track, if I open up my mixer here, you can see that I've got a track selected here where I've added an EQ, and then a compressor, and then also another EQ after that. The reason why you'd want to use an EQ before a compressor is because when you've bracketed off correctly and you use subtractive EQing, you're actually honing the signal down into something that is much more manageable for your compressor to compress and compute, right? So you want to make it so that it has to do as little work as possible because you don't want an over-compressed sound. You want a nicely compressed sound. You want something that just sounds full and still has dynamic range. This is sort of the idea. So what you'll do first is you'll add something like a regular EQ, and we have a little instance of something here that I've scooped out. For no particular reason, this is just an example so you can see that I've cut some low end down here. I didn't really bracket off a whole lot. I have this where it normally is, but we can even bring that up further. Let's bring it up to about 100 kilohertz. And you can see that around here, we have cut 7 decibels of low end out. So let's have a listen to what the track sounds like with the EQ on and with the EQ off. Here we go. So now it takes a lot of those frequencies out. Whether or not we really want that, in this case, this is just an example. It's a little bit extreme. I did this on purpose. I took a little bit of the high end out and a little bit of those very low mid sort of frequencies so that you can hear that when we pull these things out, it's going to actually make our compressor work a little bit less. So if we turn on our compressor, this is just basically set up with a 2-to-1 ratio with the threshold somewhere around 21 decibels and fairly slow, medium attack, and regular sort of long release, so we can really kind of see how the needle of the compressor is going to work. So let's check it out. Here we go. Did you notice on the meter that when I had the EQ with subtractive EQing activated, it was compressing considerably less? Meanwhile, we still had the same volume overall. Now, again, the tonal characteristics are not really what's important. I just want you to see the technical characteristics, where it's making the compressor work much less. This way, you're not overloading the compressor. It's not making the dynamics of your track crazy and sporadic. You're going to get a nice thick tone. Again, we're not exactly worrying about the sound of the tone. We're just worrying about what it's doing to this compressor. So let's leave this on for a second. Now, we already know that we've reduced the amount of work that the compressor needs to do. Now let's try to bring some of those sounds back. Let's try to bring it back and make it sound, you know, where we would want it to sound. This is where you would actually go ahead and go into additive EQing techniques, where you're going to start to add frequencies so that now that you have this nice thick compressed signal, you can now add things to make that sound better. So let's go ahead and do that. So you sort of get the idea. Now we have this controlled signal that we can then put through a second EQ that allows us to really dial in the tone that we want. Now this is a nice, solid signal, and it sounds the way that we want it to sound. Now after that, you can probably go into a lot of other types of processing. You can add other things. You can bust it out for using other effects like reverbs and modulations. You can even parallel compress things. For instance, in the instance of drums, you would have like a parallel compression for some things. This is something I can talk about in other videos if we decide to do some things like that. You let me know if that would be interesting down in the comments. Tell me what kind of EQing or compression techniques you might be interested in learning. But in most cases, this is what you're going to use 90% of the time. You might not always need a second EQ. You might be able to get the sound that you want just from the first one and then tame the dynamics through a compressor. But there are cases where a compressor will add some colorization to your sound, which does change the sound of it. It's like the compressor itself almost has its sort of own EQ in there somehow. For instance, it might make highs a little bit more brilliant. Well, that's because it's doing something in the circuitry that's bumping something or cutting something. And this happens. This is sometimes something that works really well, or sometimes it's not. It's really up to your own ears and what you think you want in your own track.